Hi everyone. So this is video 2 of for the fourth week, for the last week of the seminar, and I'm looking at Larry Johnson's piece on social activism and policy in multicultural education. I think that what's really interesting to me in this piece is the framework, right? And is the framing of these kind of large enterprises such as multiculturalism, framed by people like Banks that have, really been historically, at least in North America, one of the first. James Banks, right? It was University of Washington, and really the person that jump started the issue of multicultural education as part of a curricular and pedagogical aspects. And as they cite right away, the kind of model that he developed had these kind of 5 parts, with curriculum integration, knowledge, prejudice reduction, equity pedagogy, and then this kind of sense of school culture and social structure. And I think that 30 years later, and where we are today in terms of issues of racial equity and inequity in particular, as well as other forms of inequity, what we come to see more and more, I think, is that particularly us in educators, we have focused so much attention on, changing language and shifting pedagogy and, kind of construction of curriculum that's more far-reaching, that brings different repertoire, that is more diverse, all of which, of course, are essential. But there is a big barrier between the enactment of these bits, right, in a kind of loosely coupled way, and the changes in the kind of school culture, organizational culture, change in kind of environmental and social context, right? And not just larger societal issues, and last year's shift with Black Lives Matter, globally have changed the conversation, just as the Me Too movement 2 years ago created a renewed impact and impetus for change in terms of gender equity. But we time and again continue to see that last bit is the most challenging aspect. It's how we address the pointy ends of this process, so to speak, right? The things that are more immediately graspable to us. But we do that often without a sense of changing the environment. And what that does is that it becomes often a struggle between individuals who are doing this work and pushing the envelope, as they say in North America, pushing it forward, and the tension of a resisting environment, right? Or a pace of change between the two that is always in dissynchrony. And I think that a big part of this is, and as Johnson's article articulates further, is that when and how do we address that piece, which is very much connected to policy, right? So how do we make initiatives more structurally and systemic, embedded in the environment? How do we foster individual change and the work of individual change into the environmental change, meaning the context, right? The organization, the school, the community environment. And therefore, how do we create mechanisms that facilitate those changes and a sense of adaptability, a sense of responsiveness? So not just new things in place, right? New policy in the sense of you can't do that, you can't do that, but new policy practice also that looks at, do we have ongoing conversations? Do we have ongoing groups of individuals? Do we have an ongoing policy on adapting and looking at change, at new needs, at responsiveness to kind of student populations, to community challenges, to cultural issues that emerge? Do we have the mechanisms to set that up? And do we investigate those mechanisms in a manner equally they're equally valued than the kind of work that we do, for instance, the research that we do toward culturally responsive education, or equity-oriented education, social justice education, pedagogy, curriculum, right, repertoire, those kinds of things. I think that's significantly at the center of this, right? How the tension between the specifics and the work that is done often at the individual level, and the work that is more systemic and structural. I think it is worth noting as well that as we go through Johnson's article, and in terms of the history of the United States and the troubling aspects of relationship between social and public policy and race, we see, right, markers of legislative kind of policy, kind of enactments, both in kind of formal and hard policies, such as the kind of Jim Crow policies that led to exclusion, separate but equal, as well as landmark policies, both in terms of Brown versus education, talking about segregation in schools, or the Civil Rights Act of '64, both pro and con, right? Pro kind of democratic and equity, as well as against, right, creating segregation forms. How important these were, but I think that what is behind in there as well is a sense of that, when we think about that latter part of how do we create environments that are more welcoming and that are constantly preparing themselves for change and adaptability. One of the key aspects is to continuously think about, even when positive, right, progressive or democratic or equity-oriented policies are placed, we have to be careful to the extent at which they can be taken on, they can be used as a form of resistance, right? We say, well, we have this legislation now, we have this piece of information, we are addressing these because we say that we adopt these, but that separation between two ways, right? Separation between the policy, the hard written policy, and the soft matters in which those policies get enacted and brought into action, right? So the difference in the often gap between those soft and hard policies, including the contradictory elements between the two, but also in what ways at times this kind of ongoingness, right, of policy practice, not just a policy, gets in fact kind of reduced. It gets compressed, right? It gets by the policy itself. So policy practice toward a constant thinking about what multiculturality in this case, or equity, or anti-racist work looks like, right? And how do we create the cycles of work? We try a curricula, we experiment, we have conversations, we engage in consultation, we collaborate, we try something out, we adjust, right? How this ongoing process that is very local and very significant oftentimes gets squashed by a new ostensibly positive policy that comes and says you can't do this, or we have to do this and this and this. And then you see all these other ways in which people deflect, right, and don't really implement or enact, because that contextual aspect is not really in place, because the conversations are not really in place, because people at times don't have the tools to think through that and to enact them. They don't have the kind of the environment to adapt slowly, but importantly to these issues, right? And they at times don't have the environment to lead on those things too. And so I think that all that talks about the systemic aspect of it, and how looking at a history of an environment, oftentimes of an issue, of a position, oftentimes also helps, right, to understand where the failures are and how this, what we read in the other chapter, the kinds of feedback structures that can be put in place so that we don't see these separations. all of this leads also to the notion then of when it is and how it is that we call policy failure into place, right? When it is that we just don't continue to work under the same premise and assumption, but when we start saying, well, this maybe historically has had its place, but we're so far disconnected from that, realities have changed, and the lack of actually implementational and visible, accessible implementation outcomes, right? The result really now bring us to call this a moment of failure, right? And therefore, a moment that requires something else to come into place, right? And replace that position, that idea, that set of practices, that, you know, the ostensiveness that this work is or has been done, right? I think that calling when something has failed, right? Although the idea of failing is somewhat, you know, problematic, but when a policy is no longer useful, it's inept, it's, you know, it can be seen as eventually a full failure. How then also these ideas of feedback, understanding historically, of connecting the practice versus the text, the ongoingness versus the kind of, you know, established but not really used aspect of it, the differences between the hard policy and all the other soft policies that are either compensating or resisting against, right? When is it that we have a sense of that systemicness of the environment, and we must call also a failure of that process, right? I think that those are really important aspects that are highlighted here, right? Of course, there's a lot of context, a lot of interesting information about the specificity of multiculturalism in the U.S. Will be interesting to see how you see that these kinds of evolutions, for instance, that led to that the policy document that we discussed last week, and the kinds of things that are residual, they're still in place, the kinds of things that could be said to be really innovative and new and pushing the envelope, and in how a similar analysis such as this could be done also within issues in Finland, which will be interesting to discuss in the seminar. Hope that helps. Bye.